was listening to some things earlier and thought that it might be good for me to stress something a little bit more than I had originally planned to. Bob, when you were talking about unless we understand what the legislators and what the parents and what the policymakers are thinking, we can have this conversation all we want. And I have been, in some ways, in an odd way, privileged to hear some of that. And I think it really would be useful for us to think about what we're hearing in other spaces, because there is a tremendous amount of interest right now in creativity. I think we all kind of feel that. The California Create California report that we'll hear more about tomorrow, at the outset, they sort of frame that pretty well in terms of the way that this is being discussed in a lot of the places in D.C. that I've been in recently, which is this notion that there's a workforce that hasn't been invented yet, and we're sort of sitting here wondering how do we prepare these kids to be effective in these venues. And that becomes, I think, a really interesting and unusual in my life in the nonprofit arts sector in terms of the amount of intense interest that exists across broad swaths of the population in this subject. So every parent is sort of interested and intrigued and concerned about that. And especially, I think, on the Hill, people who tend not to think about arts as being in their portfolio do want to win the future. And it's one of those rare, very bipartisan conversations happening right now in terms of how we try to invigorate future economies. And I think the amount of assumption that exists across a lot of different, maybe unconventional advocates is that creativity is really important. And I think people tend to have some sort of a loose link that the arts helps build creativity somehow. So I think it's really terrific and important for this conversation to bring people from a lot of different types of perspectives with different toolkits to try to understand how do we measure it, what do we mean by it, how does the arts link into it. Because, very often in D.C., I have had the sense that when I come into the arts sector room where I came out of, I produced theater for many years in a nonprofit arts sector. I did the campaigns every year. I was a passionate arts advocate. But when we step out of our room, we can sometimes sound in ways that are very sector-centric. And especially when you get into education and all the parents who care deeply about their kids, they're really more interested in their child's development. And I know all of us believe that arts is a very important and integral part of their child's full development. But one of the things that I've just wrote down, I wrote this as I heard you say that, player versus victim. We established the Office of Innovation about 3 years ago, and because of that, I've been able to be involved in some partnerships that have been unusual for the agency with the Department of Defense. Lots of conversations with Office of Science and Technology Policy. We've been doing a lot of activities with the National Science Foundation, and have had a lot of conversations with Board of Science Education. So Board of Science Education, those folks are really interested in terms of how arts practice, arts training, arts activity may build cognitive competencies that can then be applied in other places. I know you guys are sort of, talking about similar things. But even I think more surprisingly when you walk out of a room with someone like Admiral Stocks at Walter Reed, and he is absolutely all in at the idea that bringing in arts intervention into an integrative care, it makes sense at the outset. And when we start seeing and getting a whiff of what's happening, he's the first one to recognize it and understand what it is and to champion it. And I think that's where that, I sometimes have a hard time answering a question on, how do you get in the room with those guys? And in some ways, they're really interested, and we opened the door and they kind of fell in. They wanted us. So I think sometimes we end up feeling like we put on these costumes of poor people asking for money at the metro. And in a lot of ways, there is something about the work that we're doing and the kinds of advances that we make in the work that we do, and what that might bring to 21st century workforce economies and to learning spaces, is something that there's a lot of people really interested in right now. So I just wanted to mention that at the outset. I do also very quickly want to mention that when Bryce and Ayanna Hudson, who's our Arts Education Director, Laura Scanlon, who's our Director of State and Locals, we thought a lot about, there's so many different things that you could bring into the room in terms of arts education and in the NEA. And obviously the states and locals are very active in this space. That's why we're all here. WESTAF has helped assemble us. NASA and a lot of the other states have been very involved in that as well. NEA Arts Education has a strategic plan that's going to be announced in an upcoming meeting that's going to look at collective impact, and a report on the Education Leaders Institute, which actually in some ways the Create California whole program spurred out of one of those. So they're going to be talking a little bit about what all of the ELIs have sort of taught us over time. And I should also just mention Americans for the Arts and a shared endeavor report that they came out with last month. January, I guess. And it also, I think, has a really good framing where you kind of imagine the learner at the center, and you have certified arts instructors, certified non-arts instructors, and arts people who are not certified and not part of the formal curriculum, and how all of how you can think about strategies that links all of those activities and capabilities together. A lot of what I have been doing over the last 3 years has been focused on the intersection of art and science. And some of this had to do with arts and health and arts and healing. I'm going to talk a little bit at the end because it has some, I think, novel and unusual sort of links to this that I wasn't expecting until I got into it a little further with the DoD work and PTSD and TBI. But most of it has had to do with convening experts from lots of different areas around types of themes. The kinds of themes that have been most present have had to do with arts and science and technology. There was a term, creative IT, that was being sort of batted around in the beginning, although NSF doesn't quite say it that way anymore. But there's been about 7 summits that have existed, or that have been assembled. 3 of them we co-funded either with NSF or with NSF and NEH. There's about 4 others that spurred out of that, the first NSF summit, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, but that were funded by NSF alone. I just have this quote, and I think it kind of, in some ways, this was the quote that we sent out in the first invitation, and it's a quote from Albert Einstein. The most beautiful experience that we can have is the mysterious. It's the fundamental emotion which stands at the cradle of true art and true science. And I think that's been, in a lot of ways, the common motivator from across the arts and sciences that we've been seeing and that we've been listening to. And I think it also, I was listening to Frank last night talking about how you motivate kids. Kids have this same sense of wonder. They want to understand the world. And how we can try to build the path for them in a way that doesn't choke that off, I think is another theme that we keep hearing over and over again. Oops. Sorry, my iPad just took a weird skip. Well, I'll go ahead and start framing the... one thing I did want to mention before we get into the summits is that there were a couple of reports that have come out over the last few years. One talked about the rationale for bringing interdisciplinary approaches to learning and practice And it came out of the National Research Council in 2012. It was a report called Education for Life and Work, Developing Transferable Knowledge and Skills for the 21st Century. And this report profiles a growing interest among business, political, and education leaders in promoting deeper learning through the acquisition of skills such as problem solving, critical thinking, and collaboration. And the report places special emphasis on the cultivation of cognitive and metacognitive skills, among which creativity and innovation are expressly noted. Together, these skills are characterized as workforce-related competencies critical to achieving a more productive and sustainable U.S. economy. And I think that, in some ways, is a more academic way of describing what a lot of the Hill conversation, they'll end up saying things like winning the future, vibrant economies. And I think the other theme that's sort of linked into that is expanding that opportunity so that underrepresented groups are able to participate in developing these skills and that they can contribute and benefit from this growth as it happens. Also, we have seen at NEA, NSF, and NEH a real uptick in projects and applications that have art and science, and it's coming in all three agencies. Right now, we have a working group that we formed with among the three agencies, and we're trying to dig into our databases to understand them a little bit better, understand how some of these projects, how do they win funding in our separate calls for applications, and how do they fail when they do, and is there something of value in those applications that aren't winning because we have a reduced amount of review criteria that we can each use. We can only look at artistic excellence. They look at intellectual merit. Actually, Nature magazine last summer did a dive of their own on our database, and they were just looking for science and technology related projects from 2009 to 2012. And they found that in 2012 we funded over $960,000 worth of projects. In 2009, it was just over $300,000. So it over tripled in 3 years. So obviously there's something in the air. There's a real fascination with science and technology and what the future can bring. I think there's a sense that practically anything can happen. There's an app for almost anything, as long as somebody could sit down and invent it. The first summit that we did was Strategies for Art, Science, Technology Research, and it was a joint meeting between the National Science Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. This convening took place on September 15th in 2010, and 55 thought leaders from across the disciplinary boundaries were convened for a 2-day interactive discussion about the challenges and opportunities for advances in the creative innovation economy and in education institutions. The main goal was to identify synergies and to foster collaborations across and between constituencies. They wanted to develop a set of actionable areas of mutual interest and to examine the national intellectual currency that bridges the sciences and the arts and technology research. Out of that convening, there came a story map. If you go to, I don't know how many people have been to very many science convenings, but they often have posters, which took some time for me to get used to. You walk in and there's all these posters explaining a project. This is sort of one of those in a way, and I'll just describe it very quickly. They basically, at the end of this, the way they visualized what this conversation was, or the point of the conversation, they envisioned 2 camps in these 2 mountain regions, and they called them worlds of knowing. So you had the art science, computer science folks on one area, and then you had the arts and humanities people over here, and then they envisioned a bridge that would take you up to this higher plane, and it's a more optimized future. And the way to get there, you had to cross a number of challenges and gaps. And a lot of them had to do with being able to talk to each other more effectively and to be able to speak back and forth across your various ways of knowing. But one of the specific opportunities that they mention in the executive report is to identify pedagogical outcomes for STEAM learning. This is the first time I'd heard the word STEAM. There has been an enrollment decline in computer science programs that integrate computational thinking, and meanwhile there's an increased enrollment in arts. And so they're saying that we must devise metrics to identify core competencies in these new pedagogies as they relate to the strengthening education in the United States. And action types that they identified were to align art, science, technology pedagogies with 21st century learning skills, scaffold those skills that were needed for engaging STEM and the arts from pre-K to K through 12, and on through lifelong learning.